Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about Autechre and their 11th album, Exai. Alright, we finally made it to the end of this series. Well, almost. Got a big odds and ends, a top 10, and an album ranking after this, but this is the last studio album from Autechre that I haven't already reviewed. Now, in the past, I have complained about projects from these guys that I feel are too out there for my tastes, often not containing much in the way of coherent consonant melody, or rhythms that are so abstract and offbeat I feel like I'm not standing on solid ground, or in the case of the two projects of theirs I reviewed before starting this series, being much too long to the point of being actively inconvenient to listen to. Exai is a project where all of these observations can easily apply. It's just over 2 hours long, spread out over 17 tracks and 2 CDs, and contains a lot of their most abstract and dense material to date, with nowhere near the focus on melody that their previous album Oversteps had. But some people who've been following me for long enough know that not only did this project get a spot in my video of 50 essential electronic albums and EPs of the 2010s, it also managed to sneak in a spot on my top 100 favorite electronic albums of all time list in 2016, ranking at number 91. So, Exai is one of my favorite projects from these guys. Depending on my mood, it could even be my favorite, beating out their debut. I mean, I think Incunabula still probably just barely gets the edge, since that's a project I can basically put on any time, and Exai, not so much. Cause it's a project that I definitely need to be in the right mood to want to put on. I've seen plenty of people tell me that this was too much for them, or that it's not their thing. For instance, while working on that Essential Albums of the Decade video, Landon Remixes and I were listening to each other's picks, and he told me that he was listening to this while playing Super Monkey Ball, and he had to stop momentarily because it was physically making him dizzy. It is not a project for everyone, I will give you that. I'm sure some people might be more surprised that I got into it as much as I did, but I stand by what I said. This project is excellent. To me, it's almost kind of like the logical endpoint to all the experiments these guys embarked upon since Confield. There's a little bit of every post-90s project of theirs in this one, and every element feels like it's working towards a higher purpose. But it also feels like it's sometimes doing new things that haven't necessarily been explored in their previous albums either. It's its own beast entirely. The word I think would best describe the appeal of Exai on me personally would have to be epic. This project's sound design is monumental in size and scope. It's not just a huge album because it's 2 hours long, it's huge sounding. I feel like I'm on some kind of insane ride through some gigantic Death Star-like megastructure. Not to mention, there's plenty of variety as well. While there are a couple of tracks here and there that don't really stand out much and blend into the dense experimental mix, nearly all of these tracks have their own flavor and distinct recognizable identity to them. But it also doesn't feel like a random, incohesive collection of tracks either. All these tracks feel like they directly fit into each other and build into one big holistic experience. So may as well get into individual tracks. Obviously I have quite a bit to say. The tone is set right away with the frantic, clanking rhythms of Fleur. Very dense and fast-moving stuff, maybe a few bassy washes or some barely present little bubbles of melody way in the background. You could be forgiven for not even noticing. Also like a minute of outro where the rhythms get a bit more sparse but still really feel like they're building up to something. And yet, despite how technically impressive and intense this track is, I would not say it's a big highlight. To me, it feels like an album intro, a warm-up for things to come. This album doesn't properly show its true colors until second track, Irlite Get Zero, a propulsive 10-minute epic that feels like it's driving you into the album's darkest depths at high speed. Has a beat with a fairly coherent pulse running underneath the whole time and driving a ton of momentum. Also has several different sections, starting out with all these electric buzzing sounds, then shifting into other dark, wubbing synth chords and other honking melodies. Other parts with dissonant, airy pads, and where it feels like the percussion is just falling apart at the seams. a fake ending a little before the halfway mark that only leads into even more dramatic melodic sections. This is a track that just has you, like, consistently on the edge of your seat, wondering what's coming next. And there's always a sense of, like, present danger. Like, you could at any moment get flung off into the distance and break every bone in your body. It's an insane roller coaster thrill ride of IDM. And this pace is kept up through the next several tracks. You got Prac F, which is mainly just a bridge between its two surrounding tracks that doesn't stand out all that much on its own, but transitions between them seamlessly, and has plenty of bouncy, clacking, foot-tapping beats and dark synth pads, and a change-up halfway through where the mix seems to double in weight and intensity. Even this track, which basically feels like an interlude, has plenty of cool ideas to keep me interested. And it leads directly into the more welcoming, if heavily metallic melodies and pads and electrically charged beats and glitches of jatevee. I suppose one of the more accessible moments on here, if you want to call it that. At least one of the marginally more lighthearted moments. Then there's Exai, a track which is almost pleasant and uplifting in comparison to the previous moments. Has all these light and breezy electric piano chords going up against its heavy, thudding beats. Although, of course, as you go on, the track gets darker and darker. It has unnervingly squeaky melodies introduced on top, some kind of like flute-like riffs shooting around. Then the more pleasant textures slowly get replaced entirely and taken out in favor of a change up into these synths that resemble like a very lo-fi synth violin, and some percussive bells too. Just gets more and more unnerving, though never fully abandoning its melodies. I've seen it compared to Surapir from Draft 7.30, has a similar deteriorating progression, although this is much more concise and doesn't go quite as far off the deep end as that track does near its closing moments. While Surapir is probably a more impressive and sprawling track, I actually prefer this one. Definitely one of the most consistent high points on this project, even from the very first time I heard it, I think back in high school. It always immediately stuck out to me in the best way. Anyways, we're led right back into the dark area we temporarily surfaced from. We got Vicos, which has all its beats forcefully slamming down and the electric melodies. It is a banger in the most visceral sense. But the whole mix eventually gets enveloped by this giant air conditioning pad that gradually fades in over the entire second half of the track, as if the ride you were on suddenly got a gas leak that ends up slowing it down to a crawl. It's a ton of dark experimental fun, and that's not even one of the better tracks here. Perhaps, unfortunately, then we get what I feel are the project's two weakest moments. Flep may still be a banger that keeps up the project's momentum and atmosphere, but doesn't really do much to stand out from the crowd. It's got these fairly distinctive, kind of percussive elements that feel like they're coming out of, I don't know, hollow plastic containers. But that's about it. Also kind of cheaply ends in a fade out. Doesn't make me want to hit skip, but it's not that memorable. And then there's Tweenorzen, the shortest track in the bunch. Its early moments are the closest this project gets to actively turning me off. After you got these low-key ambient synth plucks in the intro, these hyper-abrasive, screeching, acidy synths get introduced, and I'm just like, eh. Thankfully, the hissing mechanical beat and strange synths around it do eventually come together in a more compelling and almost even organic groove. It's really just those little screechy synth licks that bug me. Still not a bad track at all. But after these weaker moments, we have what is almost certainly the album's best moment, its midpoint, the 12-minute sorta centerpiece that is Bladelores. Another track that I immediately loved when I first heard this project, and is almost certainly like one of my top 5 favorite tracks these guys have ever done. It's like this slow, plodding, ambient techno thing. You got these beats that just kind of tap and slap along at a regular pace, with certain hits being so covered in reverb that they create this really big, airy sense of space. And then other windy pads come in that sound almost like choirs, as well as these pulsating chords and wubby, possibly dubstep influenced bass. The atmosphere this track creates is absolutely freaking gorgeous. And there's still plenty of progression too. There's one moment where like everything cuts out to make way for the bassy rumbles all by themselves, getting glitched up and fuzzy so it sounds like you're, I don't know, twisting the plug to your headphones in the jack. But those awesome glassy choir pads fade back in and envelop everything, and then eventually pick the groove right back up from where we left off. And then there's even a whole outro section that's just like 3 minutes of just that choir pad, occasionally getting glitched a little. It's freaking incredible stuff. When I first heard this, the title Bladelores reminded me of like fan blades, like you were being taken into some spacious area filled with gigantic industrial fans and propellers. And that's just how the first disc ends. The second disc of the album may not have as big high points for me as the first disc, but doesn't really have any low points either. It's much more consistent from a personal enjoyment standpoint. I mean, I suppose this disc's opener, 1-1 Is, would be one of the lesser moments from this half, but it's still great. Got some heavy clanking beats that plod along as if they were directly leading out of the groove from Bladelores, but they got these kind of squirting and plunking mid-tone melodies echoing out over the top, which kind of have a texture to them that wouldn't have been out of place on Amber. And this track is also a two-parter. Like, there's a change-up about 4.5 minutes in where the beats break step and feel like they've started to directly bore into the ground. And these high-pitched twanging guitar-like synth melodies join in later. Lots of rough and heavy fun to be had with this track. But that track feels fairly muted in comparison with its following track, nodezsh, featuring gigantic flashy keyboard leads that sound like they came out of some kind of modern EDM production and plunk around seemingly at random but still forming coherent harmonies, while a beat underneath shuffles around in a failed attempt to find some kind of solid foothold, and these whining pads on top almost seem to give the track a sense of near-orchestral bombast. I feel like I'm trying to walk through some area in zero gravity that has all these flashing colored lights all over the place. And of course, this track happens to also deteriorate and get freakier as you go on. Surprisingly, the drum patterns do eventually come together in a more regular pulse, but as that happens, the melodies and harmonies get progressively more dissonant and menacing, and by the last 2 minutes or so, all the beats just disappear altogether and let the leads plunk along in the most harsh and dissonant intervals, as if some sort of corrupted presence has overtaken the whole mix. And it feels like that directly pays off in the next track, Runrepik, where it feels like you're trying with little avail to run as fast as you can out of that freaky place. The drum machines patter away at high speed with tons of 909 snares, and the melodies are just as heavy and intense and overbearing as they were before. It feels like an extended outro to the previous track that just so happens to be even more intense and epic. And then you escape into the similarly dangerous sounding SPL9. It doesn't feel like you're being chased anymore at this point, but now you're in some like chaotic construction site with all these percussive elements slamming down and threatening to crush you under their weight, and lots of other acid-like melodies shooting off as you go on, like lasers, getting more intense and numerous the further into the track you get, even later joined by pads that sound like airplanes taking off. So that's all been pretty awesome, if ridiculously intense and chaotic. Would be nice to have a little breather moment right about now, wouldn't it? And so we get the last of the 10-minute tracks on here, Cloudline. While this track is lighter and more low-key than the 4 tracks that preceded it, it's still pretty freaky and dangerous sounding, just in a very different way. Like, you got all these squealing pads that sound like an orchestral string section playing the highest notes they can reach, and other windy textures whooshing by, eventually also including some plunky and almost funky melodies over a mix of glassy organ-like pads that waver in and out. This one feels like you're trying to walk over a long, twisting tightrope suspended way up in the air, with a fall of thousands of feet below you, and you also happen to be caught in a rainstorm. I mean, more low-key doesn't mean it's any less riveting than what you heard before. But never at any point does it feel like you've fallen off said tightrope. Maybe you came close a few times, but at the end of the track, it feels like you've made it across safely, if by the skin of your teeth, and into a new, much less dangerous indoor area, which leads us to Decalock. Another more low-key moment that is notable for the way it uses what sounds like actual human voices. I mean, it's not like actual coherent English words can be heard. I mean, in between a sparse and minimal but still heavy and thumping beat, you hear snippets of, like, a man talking but glitched up into oblivion, a glitchy Bowie-like singer for like 5 seconds, some pitched down whispering near the end, and at one point lots of synthesized choirs that also flutter between several different chords, and don't sound unwelcoming. It's a very cool and creative little moment there. I mean, you'd never expect to hear human voices in an Autechre album, and even if they're utilized in a very Autechre-y way, it's definitely a welcome change of pace. But then that brings us to Recks On, one of the album's biggest bangers. The first half of this track has this absolutely massive hip-hop beat, and the way it goes up against all the squelchy and airy electronic textures around it is totally badass sounding. This feels like the kind of track to watch Arnold Schwarzenegger walk in slow motion in front of an explosion to. And again, that's only the first half. The second half doesn't bang quite as hard or keep the hip-hop beat around, unfortunately, but instead focuses on these melodies that sound like various layers of electrical buzzing, and no less badass or tense than before. But finally, we've made it to our grand finale, YJY UX. Which actually kind of eases some of the tension built up, or at the very least lets you feel like an end to this insane journey is in sight. As these buzzing, light, fuzzy synth melodies slowly fade in and intensify into a disorienting but dense and colorful and kaleidoscopic mix. Maybe even a tad Oversteps-esque, but still much rougher and more intense than anything on there. I suppose by the standards of this album, it's optimistic sounding, but probably wouldn't be on another project of theirs. But I mean, even if it feels like you're constantly being jerked away from that light at the end of the tunnel, you're still constantly working towards it. And eventually, all the synths seem to shut down at the very end, with little tiny glitches of melody spurting out in the last couple of seconds. If this were a movie, this would be like the equivalent of having the end ? Still a satisfying and fitting way to close out this whole album. I suppose it could be my favorite track on the second disc, but if so, it's not by much. There's a lot of great stuff on the second half. So yeah, that's Exai. Still awesome from start to finish. There really aren't any tracks on here that I don't enjoy to some extent. Again, not to say it's perfect. There are still weak spots and tracks I don't think are incredible, and of course, like I said, this is not a project that I can just put on any time. It is so dense, so imposing, so pounding and intense, and also doesn't work nearly as well unless you got a good pair of headphones and you're willing to pay closer attention. I honestly wouldn't even flinch if someone told me they hated this project or were so run down by its abrasive, overbearing experimentations that they ended up bored and checked out before the 2 hours were up. Perhaps not unlike how I felt on my first listen of the NTS sessions when I tried to get through all 8 freaking hours in one go. But that's kind of the thing. First of all, time has been kind to Exai because I know lengthwise they can do so much worse than this. But even before I had braved LSEC and NTS, making this project look like a cakewalk in comparison, Exai was not a project that ever felt too long for me. No moment on here felt like it overstayed its welcome. No groove ever got stale, and the way it was produced felt genuinely exciting and had me on the edge of my seat the whole time, making those 2 hours go by a lot quicker. I don't feel that length anymore, though I absolutely would understand if you would. I have always seen Exai described as one of their most difficult releases, one that you really need to sit with and let grow on you. I suppose that was also the case for me, but even when I first heard it, even if most of it just flew over my head, something felt weirdly approachable about it. There were still tracks like TS, Exai, and bladelores that I got into immediately, and the rest of the album grew on me with more and more repeat listens. Well, I'm not gonna act like I totally got Exai on first listen. Even on my earliest listens, I still got the feeling that more visceral enjoyment was within reach for me. And now, I feel like this is one of the most exciting and fun rides that this duo ever came out with. There may be other much less demanding IDM albums out there that have drawn me in with much more repeat listens, but still, Exai is an excellent project, and I love it. One of their absolute best. I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.